Hello everyone, I'm Megan Sullivan and welcome to History in Games, the audio and video series where I play historical fiction games and talk about the real history hidden inside these wonderful games. Today, I'm once again talking about the amazing Hatshepsut and her fascinating history, while sharing my impressions of the PC version of Civilization VII so far. Remember, if you like this type of content and haven't already done so, please like and subscribe to History in Games. It really helps me out. Also, apologies in advance if I muddle some of these ancient names. So last time we played Civilization VII, Hatshepsut was the pharaoh of Egypt during the Age of Antiquity, and we talked about her tremendous influence during her real historical reign. Now we're going to see how she does in the Age of Exploration, which forces her to leave behind ancient Egypt and lead a new civilization. In this case, the Chola Empire, a naval powerhouse in southern India that ruled from the mid-9th century to the late 13th century. Why make Hatshepsut ruler of an Indian dynasty and not somewhere closer to home? Because the Chola's mercantile capabilities match Hatshepsut's penchant for trade rather nicely. So it seemed to me a good pairing. And I'll talk about that in a second. But first, let's talk history. Now, I'll be honest, I initially struggled with this episode because I couldn't really connect Egypt to the Chola Empire in any substantial way. The two cultures rarely made direct contact during the Age of Exploration. They did trade with each other, but these transactions were performed by middlemen in the Middle East, so I wasn't sure how to connect India and Egypt or whether there was anything that directly linked them. But then, as I was playing Civilization VII, I noticed I kept running into Ashoka, the Buddhist ruler of the Magadha Empire in northern India during the 3rd century BCE. He did make direct contact with Egypt, and the story is really fascinating. Granted, we have to roll things back to the Age of Antiquity to make this connection, and we're going to have to borrow a couple of other civ leaders to bridge the gap between Egypt and India. Namely, Alexander the Great, whose last appearance in the series was as a DLC character in Civilization VI, and Caesar Augustus, who was one of the starting leaders found in Civilization VII, and by the way, who gets along pretty nicely with my Hatshepsut, mostly because I use all her persuasion powers to keep the notoriously warlike Augustus on side. Now, as we know from the last episode, Hatshepsut ruled over both Upper and Lower Egypt during the early 15th century BCE. She ruled for about 20 years, and then when Hatshepsut died, she was succeeded by her stepson Thutmose III, who was succeeded by his son, who was succeeded by, well, you get the idea. In short, pharaonic Egypt lasted until the collapse of the Bronze Age around the early 12th century BCE. And even then, the pharaohs managed to cling onto power. Well, that is, until various groups of foreigners took turns ruling over Egypt, starting in the early Iron Age and lasting throughout the rest of antiquity. These groups included Libyans, Nubians, Persians, Greeks, and of course the Romans. Okay, but how does India come into play? Well, it really begins in the late 4th century BCE, when Alexander the Great defeated the Persian king Darius III in battle and inherited the entire Achaemenid Empire, which, starting in the late 6th century BCE, stretched from Egypt all the way to what is now Afghanistan and parts of Pakistan. You'd think that would be enough land for Alexander to rule over, but the ambitious young general wanted to see just how far he could expand his new empire. So he marched the Greek army further and further and further east, founding, or at least renaming, a number of cities as he went along, most of them being named after him, of course. Eventually, Alexander and his troops made it all the way to an area known as Gandhara in northwestern Pakistan, where Alexander tried to get the local chieftains to submit to his rule. But surprise, most of them put up a fight, so he did what he always did. He won in battle. But by then, Alexander's troops had had enough. They were incredibly far from home, they were tired, they were sick, they were wounded, and they were missing their families. Oh, and also, they may have just learned that there was not only an entire subcontinent left to conquer, but that didn't even include the lands beyond the subcontinent, i.e. China, which was blocked off by both impassable and impossibly high mountains and long stretches of inhospitable desert. So, when Alexander wanted to keep on marching, his army threatened to mutiny, forcing their leader to turn around and go home. Unfortunately, on the way home, Alexander fell grievously ill and died. And now there was a problem. Who was in charge of the empire? Well, his top aides and allies couldn't really agree on the answer and famously ended up going to war over the question. This is known as the Diadochon, or the War of the Crown Princes, which we don't have time to cover here. So long story short, the end result is that the empire was divided into 3 parts. The Antigonid Kingdom, which incorporated Greece, the Seleucid Kingdom, which was basically everything from Anatolia to Pakistan, and the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt. These 3 kingdoms would spend the next 300 years spreading Greek culture everywhere and absorbing local customs in turn. But ruling over a vast swath of territory wasn't easy, and it was especially hard for Seleucus, who controlled the largest and most diverse portion of Alexander's empire. So it's no surprise that just 2 decades after Alexander's conquest of Gandhara, the territory was lost to a capable warrior named Chandragupta, who went on to found the Mauryan dynasty. But Gandhara wasn't the only territory that broke away from the Seleucid kingdom. Just a few decades later, the rest of the easternmost frontier of the Seleucid kingdom declared independence and became a separate Greco-Bactrian kingdom around 250 BCE. By then, Gandhara was ruled by Chandragupta's grandson, Ashoka, who by the end of his reign controlled a vast portion of the Indian subcontinent. Now, you would think a powerful military leader like Ashoka would spell trouble for the newly independent Greco-Bactrian kings, but it turns out that wasn't the case. Thanks to an earlier marriage alignment between Chandragupta and the daughter of Seleucus, the 2 neighbors were actually pretty friendly. But that wasn't the only reason things were so peaceful, because at some point, Ashoka converted to the peaceful religion of Buddhism and decided to focus on welfare rather than warfare. Instead of sending armies into Greco-Bactria to spread fear and panic, Ashoka sent Buddhist missionaries, whom he hoped would spread the idea of Dharma, a type of moral code found in Buddhism and other South Asian belief systems. He also ordered his followers to set up large stone edicts around his empire. These edicts were written in Brahmi and stressed the importance of being morally and socially responsible. These edicts are pretty interesting, but what's really exciting is that one of the stone edicts, found in Khalsi and known as Edict 13, describes just how far Ashoka's influence spread. Here's part of the translation. Now it is a conquest by the Dharma that the beloved of the gods considers as the best conquest. And this conquest by Dharma was won here on the borders, and even 600 leagues from here, where the king Antiochus reigns, and beyond, where reign the 4 kings, Ptolemy, Antigonus, Magas, and Alexander. Likewise in the south, where live the Cholas. In other words, Ashoka was confident that he had managed to spread his Buddhist beliefs all the way south to Chola and all the way west to Egypt, where the Ptolemaic pharaohs reigned. And this wasn't an empty boast, because according to Pliny the Elder, the second Ptolemaic ruler of Egypt, Ptolemy Philadelphus, sent an ambassador named Dionysius to the Mauryan court. So direct contact was made between the kingdoms of Egypt and India. And these ties would become even stronger in the Roman period. How do we know? Because we have written evidence, but more importantly, we have archaeological evidence to back this up. Archaeologists discovered a marble statue of the Buddha while excavating a temple found in the Egyptian port of Berenike. Standing a little over 2 feet tall, this Buddha statue, dating from around the 1st century CE, was likely made from marble found in western Anatolia and carved by a local craftsman, possibly a native of India who had settled in Egypt. And this wasn't the only bit of physical evidence linking the 2 countries. Also found in Berenike were 2 coins minted in India in the 2nd century CE, as well as a 3rd century inscription written in Sanskrit dating to the reign of the emperor Marcus Julius Philippus, known as Philip the Arab. In short, there were direct links between India and Egypt in the Age of Antiquity. which is really cool. But although we've established a direct link between Egypt and India, we haven't really connected this link back to Hatshepsut herself, which kind of makes sense considering what a big deal it was for her to expand trade and diplomatic relations with her immediate neighbors to the south and east. So it's not surprising we hear nothing about trade with India. But that doesn't mean the two countries never traded during the Bronze Age. And in fact, they must have at some point because of what was found on, or maybe I should say in, Ramesses II, who ruled Egypt in the late 13th century BCE. While investigating his mummy, archaeologists found something surprising up his nose, which was peppercorn. Peppercorns are native to India, but they were used in the mummification process of Ramesses the Great over 1,000 years before Ashoka sent an embassy to Egypt. Not only that, archaeologists found an underground workshop at Saqqara that dates back to 600 BCE. In this workshop, Egyptian undertakers used a gum-like resin only found in parts of India and Southeast Asia as part of the mummification process. So although it's unlikely that India and Egypt traded directly with each other at this point, peppercorns and rare resin prove that the two countries were at least aware of each other and may have been trading via middlemen from the Middle East. And so now that we've talked about the fascinating real-life connection between ancient Egypt and ancient India, let's go back to the age of exploration. How did my Hatshepsut fare? Well, just okay. She and the Chola Empire managed to establish some new trade routes, build an overseas settlement, and build new wonders, like the White Tower. I love that the White Tower is just chilling right in the middle of the Nile, and all of her subjects are like, that's normal. Hatshepsut also managed not to get roped into other people's wars, although it meant constantly taking a neutral stance, which I don't think any of my allies appreciated. Now, I'll be honest, I'm still learning the ropes here, and I'm not even sure I'm playing correctly, but honestly, at this point, I'm just trying to survive until I see how all of this comes together, which is why for now, I'm focused on opening trade routes, keeping my population happy, and trying not to step on anyone's toes. Yeah, I know, that's boring, but Hatshepsut has managed to survive 2 whole ages without succumbing to complete disaster, so I think this method is working so far. But will this strategy work in the modern age? Can Hatshepsut survive modernity? Stay tuned to find out.